We recorded.
The first thing you recorded was me getting my retinas incinerated. So, hi everyone. Welcome to Reasonable Faith. My name is Yagus. I am the president, as y'all know me by. Just a couple of things, reminders. Next week is spring break. We will not be meeting here. Woo! Thank you, Jake, for your enthusiasm about not seeing your friends.
Yeah!
So, next week, spring break, we won't be meeting here. Don't come here, we won't be here.
Aww.
I know. Following week, ideally, will be a boba social event. So, like, in the week after spring break, that Saturday will be our first boba social. I wanted to put it on your calendar so that you could start inviting your friends and be like, hey, there's this boba thing where if your friends might not want to go to a Reasonable Faith event, but they would love to come to a boba event, they might say, hey, I don't like lectures, but boba and board games sound fun, so invite them to that.
And free boba.
Oh, free! Everything there is free.
That actually makes so much of a difference.
Everything is free with enough effort. I didn't say that.
You did?
Scratch that from the record.
We can't, it's recording, we're live right
It's
now.
on the internet.
It's literally on the internet, forever. Anyway, shirts, $10, pay Alan, and then I think that's it.
Taco
What?
Bell tonight?
Taco Bell?
Mm-hmm.
Or Jollibees?
Oh. I don't know.
I thought it was Taco Bell.
Yeah, I
We
think
will
it's.
vote afterwards.
Okay.
We can solve that problem later.
Whatever we don't do this week, we'll do not next week.
Honestly,
the
I'm
week
just casting my
after.
vote against Taco Bell.
Does anyone actually enjoy Taco Bell or just tolerate it?
Anyway,
Really?
Alan, would you like to come up and talk about our speaker? Thank you so much for listening.
Yeah, hey, I just want to express thanks for Travis coming out. This is Dr. Travis Dickinson. He is now the head of the philosophy department at Dallas Baptist University, and he taught out at the Southwestern Seminary in Fort Worth. He still lives in Fort Worth, so he drove a long way through intense traffic to get here, so we really appreciate him being here. And this topic is very near and dear to my heart on doubt. But he's got other books as well. I've asked him to talk about his books he's authored, and there's an opportunity for us to buy them here, so that'd be great if you guys are interested in that. You could read it over spring break. Anyway, yeah, he has, how many kids do you have?
4 kids.
4 kids, yeah, so he's a good family man, great Christian guy, and I'm so glad you talk and vlog about doubt like you do, so thanks for being here.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm going to just be a little to the side of that projector so that my retinas don't get burned out. So, sorry, burned yours out. Well, awesome. So, yeah. So there I was, sitting in a seminary classroom, not unlike this room, about this size probably, and I was doubting my faith, like big time. And it was really kind of the first time I was doubting my faith. And the significance of that a little bit, just to know a little bit about my background. I grew up in a very, very Christian home, about as Christian as the home could be. I'm like, I think 5th generation in ministry in my family. So my folks and my grandparents, and I actually got to grow up at a Christian ministry that brought in guys that were addicted to who knows what, all kinds of things. And so they would come in. It was usually their last stop. And as a kid, I even remember watching them come in and just be broken by sin, broken by their lifestyle and so on. Because usually this ministry was the last stop for them, like literally in some ways. So they would come in skinny, broken, kind of sad, just darkness. And they'd often get saved. They'd come to Christ. They'd get happier. They'd brighten up. They'd gain weight usually. Sometimes too much, but anyway, right? And it was really powerful for me as a kid to like watch this radical transformation happen. Of course, didn't articulate it at the time, but I think it was a powerful apologetic in a way, right? Because it was watching the power of the gospel transform lives. So that's what I grew up in, though. That's the kind of setting that I grew up in. We were in church anytime the doors were open. I went on everything, youth retreats, camps, international mission trips even, and all of that. And I never really asked the question, why I think this is true, right? And sitting in that seminary classroom, in that moment, what I realized is I didn't believe because it was true, right? It was some other because, it was some other reason, it was some other basis for my belief. And I think, of course, it was because my parents believed and my grandparents believed, and they're, all the way back to my great-great-grandfather, who started that ministry in New Jersey, in any ways where I grew up. But right, and so I just never asked. I'm sure I asked questions, but it wasn't that like deep wrestling of where you're asking why I think this is true, where you're like open to the possibility of it being false. You know what I mean? Like there's a way in which Christians can kind of sit around asking why and asking questions, but we kind of think we already have the answer. And I'm sure I did that, but I never really asked why, where there was the genuine possibility that this may not be true. And so that was a big moment, and it was a tough moment, and it was something I had to wrestle through. But here's the thing, and here's kind of the spoiler, right? Is that I leaned into that doubt, and I found a lot of truth. I found a lot of answers to these questions. There's a lot of things to answer the question why I think it's true. And I came out with a much greater faith. And that's the kind of irony, and one reason why I like to talk about, and one reason I wrote the book about doubt. That sounds bad. I didn't write the book, and not the metaphorical sense, the literal sense. The literal sense. In any case, because I think doubts are valuable. I think doubts are good in a way. Like I don't want to stay there. They're not that good. Right? There's whole like movement of this sort of deconstruction movement and this sort of thing that kind of celebrates doubt, and it sort of is the place where you end up in a way. And what I want to say is that doubt's not the destination, but it's an important, kind of stop along the journey. So that's where we're going tonight. And I would love for this to not be just a lecture or a monologue, and so feel free to ask questions. I'll definitely leave time at the end to ask questions too. But let me just sort of dive in and sort of give you some of these points, because this is where I think, just trying to figure out what the value is and how it relates to faith, especially. So here we go. So, right, I mean, you've probably heard this, right? You've heard this, that 60 to 80% of Christian youth are walking away from the faith. In my circles, we have a name for it. We call this the youth exodus. So this is going on, and it's your peers. So it's college students are sort of hitting college campuses that have grown up in churches, and they are walking away from the faith in droves. Now, don't tell anybody, but I don't think this is all bad, because I think that there's a way in which the church, the parents, like so your peers' parents, I bet you 60 to 80% of them are just sort of nominal Christians anyways, right? And so that I bet you those numbers track of people who do go to church, but they don't really believe it. It doesn't really make much difference in their life. They're not raising their kids as Christians, and I think a lot of those kids are sort of walking away. So it is a bad thing. I don't want to say it that way, but I think it is a purifying thing, because I think those that have a real and genuine relationship with Jesus, right, are the ones left. But I am worried about, because I don't want, as Ellen said, I've got 4 kids, right? And I can kind of do math with the 68%. So I'm a little nervous about that myself. This is something I think about a lot. And so when we ask the question, why? The first thing I want to say is it's way more complicated than this answer is going to look like. I think any sort of sociological phenomenon like this, right, it's obviously very complicated. But I think in part, one reason why is because churches don't tend to be a safe place to doubt our faith, to doubt and question our faith.
Let me jump on you for 1 second.
Jump on me?
Well,
Please don't jump.
jump on this slide.
Yeah.
Let's go with that.
Okay.
So I've seen that stat plenty of times, and I've done a little digging on it. and I can't really find a lot of background, and they leave it as a bullet point, and, single stats are always,
Yeah,
they can tell any story you want, right? So, the other side of it, that only 30-40% of them actually return to the faith. But do you know, by any chance, how that tracks against a historical record? Because I've always wondered about that. Like, you're right, people that are social Christians these days, in the
Yeah.
past, you had to remain a social Christian because society
Yeah.
demanded it, and these days.
kids are just more honest.
Yeah, well, if you're an
No.
atheist, nobody cares, right?
Yeah.
Whereas 20, 30, maybe more than 20 years ago, 30, 40 years ago, if you're an atheist, it was like, oh my God, they're an atheist.
Yeah.
So there's that, everybody would preserve, oh no, I'm a Christian,
Yeah.
even if you really didn't believe
No, it is, it's, so if you look at the sources that I looked at were the, Barna does a lot of these studies and so on, and then, Barna's the one that's been tracking it the longest, I think. Because theirs, I think, is over a 15-year period that they've been tracking the numbers, and it has gone up. So when I first started talking about this, it was 60. Barna now has it, I think, at like 65, something in that area, maybe 64. But there's an SBC study that puts it all the way up to 88%. That's the kind of range, but yeah, and then if you look at like what it's gone over the last, I'm not sure how far back it goes, but the trend goes up like that. So yeah, it's definitely increased.
Okay. Well, because that's really very important.
Yeah, it is, but even if the statistic is overinflated or underinflated or whatever the case is, like I can think of, I was a youth pastor way back in the day, probably about 20 years ago. 20 years ago, it was 2003, that I was youth pastor, and I've kept track of some of the kids in my youth group, and I tell you, I'm hard pressed to find one that still is a Jesus, following person.
Wow.
Yeah, almost all of them have walked away from the faith, and they were in my youth group for a time at least. And so it's probably not even hard for those of you that grew up in the church to think of friends who've walked away and so on. So I think this resonates, again, even as I agree with you, and I always do worry about statistics, and I can get you more details on it, but this is definitely something.
I don't think
that
they're
holds true.
overinflated. I was just wondering how because I could never find any information on how.
Yeah,
like, the
Barna's
trend.
a great resource for that. They've been doing this for a long time.
Not to dig too deep on it, but like if you look at the people are always quoting the number of atheists in the Academy of Sciences and all that, and it's a vast majority, well, not vast, but it's a majority, but you look at it and it's been and that's alarming until you look at it, that it's been consistent percentage-wise since
Right.
1905, right?
Okay.
So then you're like, well, okay, so that's meaningful, but not as much, but I'll let
All
you
right.
get to slide 2.
Yeah, you're right, that's right. What I suspect is that a lot of students that are walking away, at least, at some point in their journey, they do in fact believe. And I'm not questioning anybody's like sincerity of belief. What I'm concerned about is the basis of their belief, like the reasons for which they believe, the because. And I think that there are many, if we're honest, I think there's a lot of Christians, a lot of folks in my own church, I would say, that believe, and again, not because they found it to be true. I know I'm preaching to the choir. You guys are part of Reasonable Faith and so on, and this is probably like your biggest worry about your church too, right? But when you try to talk to somebody about apologetics, they do the stupid joke of like, oh, are you learning to apologize? What are we talking about here? People just don't even know when you've got these vast resources of apologetics and so on. So I think that's kind of what I'm concerned about, is that there's a lot of folks that were like me sitting in the seminary class. And I'm literally preparing for ministry. And I realized that I didn't believe because I knew it was true. I believed because pressure on me as a kid growing up in a family of ministry and so on. Okay, so here's my thesis. My thesis is that asking deep and difficult questions is not only okay, but it's a crucial part of Christian discipleship. And again, I know I'm preaching the choir here, right? Because this is what you guys do, I'm assuming, week in, week out. But, right, it's good to be reminded that asking the deep and difficult questions, it's not only just okay, but it's absolutely crucial for Christian discipleship, right? And that's what I want to sort of demonstrate some tonight. All right, so let's dig into this. Now, when we do ask those deep and difficult questions, what's going to happen is doubts are going to come. I just think that's part of the deal. Now, it's not to say doubts will for sure come, and it's not to say, like, some people are more given to like the struggle of it all. But typically, when we begin to ask the deep and difficult ones, right? You with me? Right? It's like that can be a little tough. It can be a little uncomfortable. You start to sort of say, like, "Ooh, yeah, that one stings a little bit. I don't know where to go with that. I don't know how to solve that," or so on. What I'm suggesting, what I want to give you tonight is sort of a way forward with that, and how to think of that, and how to lean into it. So to do that, I've got to do the professor thing, and that's to run some definitions. Hopefully that's okay. Everybody can't proceed without, getting some definitions out there. So let's talk about what doubt is, on my view. There's different ways to think of doubt. I think, though, like when you read other books on doubt and so on, like sometimes it gets defined differently, but I think oftentimes they're looking at the manifestations of doubt. There's a lot of ways that doubt can kind of show up for us, I think. I think it can sometimes show up as an emotional experience in ways. I remember one time I had a student come to my office, and she had just gone through my entire apologetics class. And she came into my office like struggling with the problem of evil. And so, and just how could God, there could be a good God that's allowing like the pain and suffering and so on. And so I start like doing my thing, like doing the intellectual stuff, and she's like, "No, I know all that." But I look, she was doing a lot of missions and been to some places that are just completely impoverished, people that are deeply struggling just to live, right? And it's like how she could like look into the face of these children who are starving and see how they're like, it's an emotion, it kind of shows up in emotional, but I think that's a manifestation of doubt, right? I think there can even be a kind of like rebellious spirit kind of thing that we might even label as doubt. I think that's what the Bible is often talking about. For example, in James chapter 1, when it talks about doubt, just being tossed around and kind of be wishy-washy, that kind of thing. I think that's a manifestation of doubt. What I try to do in the book is try to sort of boil it down to like, what is the core of doubt? And what I suggest is that doubt is when one of our beliefs seems as if, right? It's this sort of seeming state, as philosophers we'll talk about sometimes. It seems as if the belief might be false, right? It just has that draw. It's almost like if you've ever seen, right, the old sci-fi movies where like every like ship has a tractor beam, and you can kind of suck the other ships out. I don't know what you're going to do with them, but like that's kind of what doubt's like. You're considering an objection, or maybe you're just thinking about your own belief, and you're kind of just all of a sudden you find yourself in the grips of feeling like this belief might be false, right? That's what I'm labeling as the core of doubt, and then that can fester, that can manifest in a lot of different ways. But it's when ultimately I think it is the core of it myself, when it seems like it might be false. So, but important to remember that seemings aren't always reality, right? So that's why our belief can seem false, but we still believe it. It's not like it's gone, and it might still be true in the same way that the pencil seems like it's bent, but right, we know that it's not. Now, sometimes seemings seem the way they do because, right, it is true or whatever. So but I'm just saying like it's that midway point. In fact, sometimes I think it's the word doubt means sort of double-minded or having some duplicity, like you kind of see the same root words there. It's kind of, as Os Guinness will put it, like we're in two minds. Like it's that sort of midway point where we haven't yet conceded the objection or whatever it is, but it does seem like our belief might be false. All right, what do you think of that? Is that okay for a definition? I think I've got another way to say it here in a sec. Yeah, feeling the force or pull of an objection. That's often, it's kind of the flip side of it, right? So one side of the same coin is when our belief seems false. The other side is when we feel the pull of an objection to one of our beliefs. Right? Two sides of the same coin in a way. So doubts can be slight, or they can upend our very life and our well-being. Right? It could be just like, well, I think my dental appointment is tomorrow at 2. I'm having some doubts about that. It could be that, which is, I mean, maybe that's a big deal. I'm not sure, but right. But it could be like our faith, or it could be like, is this best friend of mine faithful to me, or whatever. We got doubts about all kinds of things, and for me, as I'm suggesting, it's when our belief begins to seem like it might be false. Usually, there's an objection in view. Usually, there's some sort of problem in view, and we kind of feel the force of it. We're kind of in its tractor beam. All right. Now, what I always want to do is say that if you experience doubts, I want to just say you're normal, right? I think that's a normal part of the process. As I'll say here in a minute, maybe I'll say right now, that I have a whole chapter in the book that argues that we don't have certainty, and we shouldn't aim at certainty for almost any of our beliefs. Certainty, like this, we kind of like put this ideal of certainty out there. I remember a friend of mine was becoming a member at a church, and the pastor had just he had to meet with the pastor personally at this church, and his final question for him was, "Are you absolutely certain that Christianity is true?" And of course, he was a philosopher, and so he said no. So they had a really big conversation. But right, I mean, it's like, what do we mean by certainty? In my sense of certainty, what I mean is that there's no possibility, there's not even a conceivable way in which your belief could be false. Right? I just don't think most of our beliefs ever rise to that level.
None of them.
None. I mean, well, arguably, I'm again a philosopher. Yeah, there's I think like principles of logic and mathematics. Some of those things might rise to the level of certainty, but
Boston brains.
well, if you're in my class, right, for intro to philosophy, you get used to like questioning whether or not you have hands. So it's I'm open to that. About
I just had
Our
this
former
conversation
president
with
just quoted with, our former president just quoted with, "I'm not even sure that my wife exists."
Right. Not certain. Yeah.
You're not certain.
Not certain.
But it's reasonable and rational. to
But
believe.
here's what I say we need to aim at. What we need to aim at is confidence, right? Because again, I'm not absolutely certain in that really strict sense of certainty that I have hands, but I'm confident. I'm not absolutely certain you're even out there, but I'm confident. I'm not absolutely certain Christianity is true. And I don't think you are either. I just don't think we can get to that level. And, right, because if all it takes is for it to be merely possible that the belief is false, well, I would even say somebody like the Apostle Paul is not 100% absolutely certain in that sense, because he considers the possibility that it's false. 1 Corinthians 15, right, where he says that if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then we're of all men to be pitied, and our faith is in vain, and so on. It seems to be he's considering that. He's not drawn to it. He doesn't believe it. It's the Apostle Paul. I'm pretty sure he's got his mind made up. I'm pretty sure he's confident. You with me? Right? But he doesn't have that absolute notion of certainty. When we have that, when we try to have that, in the book, the chapter is called. Actually, I don't remember exactly. It's called something like "Certainty is a House of Cards." Right? Where you've seen the House of Cards, where it's like, whoever has this amount of time on their hands, I don't know, but they stack cards up on their end and build this whole thing. And it's just by definition precarious. You take one card up, the whole thing comes crashing down. And I think that's the way it often goes with certainty, is that if we aim at certainty and then one question comes along and the whole thing comes crashing down, because all of a sudden we're not certain, we've got a question. So if you're doubting, I just think that's normal. That's part of the process of asking the deep and difficult questions, to feel a little pull, to feel a little struggle. Look, you're just normal, but just don't stay there. That's the point. My claim is that doubts, when handled properly, lead to truth and knowledge. When we lean into those things, right, you get answers. One way or the other, right? And that's always the struggle. My greatest fear is somebody says, okay, I'm going to lean in, and they walk away from the faith. But right? Even there, like, they're at least asking the questions and digging in and hopefully coming to reasonable answers. I would much rather that in a way than people who are just believing because their parents said so or their pastor said so. For me and my story, right, doubts led to an even greater faith, and so that's what I want for all of us. All right, let's talk about faith here briefly, and again, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. This is the part that I think might be pretty profitable or valuable to you. One of the things that I get to talk to teenagers, I get to talk in churches and so on, and I always wanted to, like, again, just really push that point to say, look, if you have doubts, you're normal. In fact, you're probably more courageous in a way than those that aren't willing to ask those questions, right? I admire a kid who's sort of willing to ask the questions, even if it causes them to struggle. But I always say, hang on, because you can have faith in doubt and not explode, right? Not spontaneously combust. Those are consistent, and I try to give this illustration. Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm thinking, this calls to mind, what is it? When where sin abounds, grace abounds more, all the more, like from Romans.
Yeah.
And like in the same way where doubt abounds, faith can abound more.
Yeah, right. In a way, that's I've never made that connection. That's good. Yeah, because if, like, right, there's a big if there. If we lean into that and find truth, and again, like, that's my experience. Like, what I worry about is the kid who has doubts is told, hey, you just gotta have certainty. Just knock off the doubting, because that's never worked for me. When I try to knock it off, the doubts come back, and they typically bring with them friends. And now I have a lot more doubts. Like, that's never been very helpful. But when I've leaned in, right, it's led to faith. So I love that. That's beautiful. All right, but let me give you this illustration to suggest that you can have faith and doubts, and that's perfectly fine. Again, you don't want to stay there, but that's fine for a time. So if we were about to get on an airplane, right, and somebody came up to us and just starts asking us these deep and difficult questions about airplanes. Do you know how much an airplane weighs? Well, if it was a 747, it's about 1 million pounds, as I understand. So one time I was speaking like an engineer or somebody came to me, it's like, no, actually it's this, around 1 million pounds. Let's just go with that. 747. 1 million pounds, right? And then he says, do you know what airplanes are made of? Metalish, metal things, right? Things that are typically don't fly through the sky. Do you know how many processes have to be timed, like, really perfectly? Okay, all these sorts of questions. Like, we might start to have doubts and questions we don't know what to do with, right? We start to feel the pull that big 1 million pound chunk of metal shouldn't be able to fly through the sky. But notice, when your flight's called, and let's say we're going someplace good, with a beach, tropical, I bet when your flight is called, I'm getting on. I don't know about you, but I'm probably getting on that flight, even if I have some questions I don't know how to answer. Are you with me? Right? So now here's the beautiful picture, I think, is you can be on the airplane, doubting the airplane.
It's called turbulence.
Turbulence, right. That might make you even more struggle, but right, you can be sort of on the airplane struggling, and I think that's not a bad picture of the Christian journey, isn't it? Like, we sort of get on board at a certain point, and we don't have much figured out, and then we go along our journey, and we can be placing our faith in Christ the whole time, and be wondering and wandering and trying to figure it out as we go, having some struggles, but it doesn't mean you don't have faith. In the same way you're relying on the airplane, you're placing your faith in it, while having some doubts and questions along the way. Os Guinness says it well. He says, doubt is not the opposite of faith, right? Unbelief is, right? Clearly. Unbelief just is the lack of faith. It's doing other than the placing faith. Okay, so what is faith? Again, here's the professor, Emmy. We got to define this too. Faith, on my view, is just ventured trust. In fact, this was a Tim McGrew. It was like a offhand remark he made, and I was like, oh, that's perfect. I'm gonna use that. Right. So, what I try to say is that faith is ventured trust, because there's a venture to it. Like we sort of entrust ourselves to something or someone, perhaps. Right, you're venturing yourself on your chairs right now. I mean, it's not a big venture, but it's still a venture there. We definitely venture. That's why I love the airplane illustration, because it's like you really do entrust your whole life to the airplane when you get on board. I'm not trying to make anybody fear flying anymore. But, in fact, I was interviewed by a woman one time for a podcast, and afterwards she's like, I have this really extreme fear of flying, and I was really struggling. Sorry. Right, but we entrust ourselves, even relationally, I think, and I think this is where it gets to like Christian faith. There's definitely a sense when we enter into a relationship with someone, again, maybe in small ways, but maybe in big ways, right? I think that's when you look at Scripture, obviously it often relates our relationship to God with marriage, right? As a pretty beautiful like illustration of. In fact, I think Ephesians 5 is talking about that, trying to relate human marriage to our relationship to God and so on. Right, when you walk the aisle to get married, like you're venturing your life on someone in a big way. Right, that's all faith is. Now we can do it with really good reasons, or we can run to Vegas and just, who cares, and get married for no good reason whatsoever. Like, I just would not suggest that, right? We could, so if that's your takeaway tonight, there you go. But no, right, if you're about to get on an airplane, and it's like rusted out, and it's like leaking fluids, and it's like smoking, and, you could get on board, just you shouldn't. Right? It's not a good idea. And so often faith takes some good reasons, again, having that good and solid basis for believing. Right? You probably didn't come tonight thinking you get dating advice, but here you go. Like, if you're going to entrust yourself to a person, you should do it for good reasons, I think. It doesn't sound very romantic, but right, I'm sure we can make a country song out of it or whatever. We have good evidence for your... Anyway, okay. All right, any thoughts on that? What faith is? Oh, you had your hand up before. I'm sorry.
So you're a pastor, right?
No, I mean I am an elder at my church, so I guess technically.
He's a
but not
philosophy
vocationally.
prof.
So you're one of the, so that means you're one of the flight staff. If you're one of the flight staff, that means you really do have to trust.
But who's the pilot in this illustration?
Right.
Okay.
Actually, in the airplane, it's called a yoke.
Yeah, take the.
Jesus, take the yoke, doesn't roll off the tongue.
Hey.
All right. Now, here's my suggestion for us, and again, this might not be for you, but maybe for somebody that you know that's struggling with doubts. This is a Dallas Willard line, but I've stolen this too. That we need to doubt our doubts, right? Our doubts shouldn't win by default. That's again what I think happens too many times is kids just kind of come along, or students I should say, come along and they have some doubts, and they just let the doubts sort of beat them up in various ways. But here's what I say is we need to sort of put them in their place too and doubt our doubts. Really what I'm saying is, right, once we've sort of realized, okay, I'm normal, it's fine. It's not like having doubts means I don't have faith. Right? These are not opposites, as again puts it. I can get a little emotional distance, right? Because that's why it's so important to tell kids this, to tell students this when they're doubting their faith. Like, it's okay. You're normal. Don't be so worried about it. Take a deep breath. Some really amazing heroes of the faith have doubted the faith deeply, right? And you can't read the Bible, in fact, I think, without seeing many people along the way, perhaps maybe all the, sort of major biblical figures doubting the faith. You can't read the book of Psalms right? And the prophets, without seeing these guys just crying out to God, like, where are you, God? Like David, like his enemies are, at the doorstep and they're about to destroy him. And it's like, God, you're gone, you're distant. Where are you? I imagine that falls in the category of doubting, right? I imagine that they struggled with that. And again, they didn't blow up or spontaneously combust. Right? It was okay. In fact, those were important moments where maybe God did show up, right? Or they learned something about God, right? You can't read the book of Job. Like, that's probably the best example of someone who's going through the thick of it. And you look at kind of where the struggles were. It's just like, God, why? And notice it's okay. It's okay. Now, it is interesting that Job doesn't get a lot of answers to his questions, or maybe no answers to his questions. But we can talk about that at the end if you like, because God does show up at the end. And that's what Job really needed. He didn't really need to know why. He really just needed to know God. Okay, but with some emotional distance, it's time to investigate, I'd say. Because here's the thing, doubts need evidence themselves. Like, it really is a kind of weighing of things. So I always like to remind Christians that they probably have far more reasons to believe than they realize. Because it doesn't have to be just like the formal arguments that you're going to get in, books. If anybody's interested. No, I was going to. But anyway, no, right? It's not just about this stuff, after all, right? I think some of the most powerful apologetics comes from just journeying with God and having God show up in various ways in our lives, right? And so, like, in my growing up experience, I think that's a powerful reason I just didn't kind of realize that. I just didn't kind of think about it or wasn't able to articulate it. And so why would we let a doubt that just sort of pops in defeat what might be a very, reasonable faith? There you go, reasonable faith. That's free. That was free. So we need evidence. We need to investigate. We need to look at the evidence and weigh these things out. Okay, here's my point about not aiming at 100%. I knew that was coming at some point, but we don't want to aim at 100% certainty. Instead, aim at confidence. Right? I will say to you that I am 100% confident that Christianity is true, with no hesitation. Do I have questions? Yeah, I got a lot of questions. Do I have some doubts? I really don't struggle with the doubts at this point in time, right? But I can sometimes feel that. I can look at something like the problem of evil, and like my student who's like looking into the face of these kids who are starving and so on, like, I could feel that, absolutely, and wonder, like, where are you, God? What does this point to, is there some problem or other? So I've got a lot of questions, but confidence can tolerate questions in a way certainty can't. Yeah, in the back.
You said you have 100% confidence. Doesn't that mean certainty? Do you have
No, I don't think so. No, I think of it as, right, I'm 100% confident that you guys are here. I'm 100% confident that, in other words, that you're not like figments of my imagination, or that I'm in the Matrix right now. Right, you guys know the Matrix.
Because if a thing has a probability of 1, or because if a thing has 100% probability of happening, then it's certainly happening.
Yeah, no, I just mean the sort of like confidence that I have in the truth of a belief when it's, well reasoned and good evidence for it. It doesn't take certainty for that. Now, some of this is just terminological. We could use the word confidence to mean, a probability of 1. But that's not how I'm using the term here, right? So I'm just saying I've 100% jumped in on Christianity. I'm 100% on it. I'm 100% confident that Christianity is true, that the Bible is true, that Jesus, died and rose from the dead. I'm 100% confident in these truths, so much so that I've given my life to it. But I got a lot of questions. There's a lot of holes. I mean, not a lot of holes. There's a lot of holes. I said there's a lot of holes. I'm not wishy-washy on it at all. It's just that I've got questions. I don't know how to work it all out. Problem of evil gives me pause sometimes. Old Testament violence, or violence in the Old Testament gives me pause sometimes. Right? Various sort of textual issues can sometimes give me pause. The problem of hiddenness, if you guys have looked at that, can give me pause at times. So like, I've got questions, but I feel like I've got so much compelling evidence for its truth that I'm 100% confident. Yes, sir.
My question kind of piggybacks off of his. So, like, how are you defining confidence? Is it kind of like what brings you to the tipping point of taking action and staking your life
I
on
think
it, or-
something like that, yeah. Yeah, kind of, but I want to think of it as rational confidence, right? So it's sort of like, there's a solid basis for my belief where what else would I be 100% confident about?
Is it sort of like you're confident that the weight of evidence is on one side of the scales?
Yeah, I
and
think so,
than the
something like
other?
that. Like, I'm 100% confident this building's not gonna fall down, on top of us here before the class is over.
I was gonna say I'm 99% confident, but.
Well, BT.
Yeah,
If you say tonight, then yeah, that's pretty low probability.
yeah,
But you
Because I
never
guess I'm
know.
just
There's some
thinking
time.
about
Earthquake.
it from like, you could say, oh, I have 51% certainty, so the weight of evidence falls on that. So I was
Yeah.
asking, like,
yeah, that's what I say.
because it's somewhere between like, it's not just about probability, but somewhere between like 50% and 100%. But if you were to stick a number on it, and I know that's not what you're going for.
And I'm not, and I probably shouldn't say it the way I said it, because it's probably more rhetorical than it is trying to be careful. Right, but, yeah, it's not just 50, like, if we are putting numbers on it, it's not just 51%. It's in some way that I've given my whole life to it, like, and we're giving our lives to the structural integrity of this building right now. I'm gonna give my life to my car, it's sort of being confident. Maybe that's not 100%, but no, it should get me there. Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like what you're kind of meaning by confidence there is just kind of like having enough evidence for something to act as if it is 100% true.
Yeah, something
Even
like
if it's
that.
not
That's
necessarily,
good.
because like, yeah, it's not, I mean, I'm 100% confident that this room's not gonna collapse tonight.
Right.
I'm not 100% certain, and definitely, we could, something,
Yeah.
an earthquake could happen, they're quite rare here,
Right.
but it could always happen. Stuff like that could happen, but I do not have enough evidence to say that's going to happen to actually make any attempt to escape this room right now because I'm afraid of that. I have no action based on that because I'm not confident enough that that would happen.
Right,
So-
good, yeah. And that really is the distinction I'm trying to make, is between certainty, which these wild possibilities take away my certainty, right? If those are even just merely possible, then I don't have 100% certainty. But I still seem to pretty confident, pretty confidently get on board. Airplanes, come into this building, very, very confident. So again, I probably shouldn't put a number on it, but I'm not sure what's gonna happen when I hit forward. Is there another question there?
Well, just
Yeah.
a second point, I did want to challenge that a little bit.
Okay, yeah,
Um,
thank you.
Well, a couple years ago, I had a major crisis of faith. It sounds like we kind of had some of the same, not exactly the same, but kind of walked a similar path with that. And I got to admit, like, I kind of heard a lot of that, being more a lover of God, praying on it, all that stuff. And in my opinion, and from my experience, it was a little problematic because when I had those little monsters come out of my brain, it was an avalanche, right? And at that point, I was pretty convinced that it was probably not going to hold water. And so
You mean Christianity?
Christianity, yeah. Big science background and, very secular upbringing. So trying to approach it as a lover of God held nothing for me. That was
Yeah.
like almost a joke. Like, you can't come in acting like that's good for the people, like I always look at it as a spectrum of uncertainty, with certainty 0 to 100, if you will. And like, so your 80 plus are the people that really do still believe, but they have those questions and doubts and all that, and they probably could approach it as a lover of God. But for folks like me that were down in the 20, 30 zone, that would never work, because at that point, I thought when I really actually looked under the covers, it was all falling apart. I was certain of it, but I just wanted to do my due diligence because it was so important.
Yeah, let me explain kind of what I mean here. So, I think that there is, because a big part of the book, again, for me at least, or maybe I haven't said this yet, is not just to talk about doubts, because there's a bunch of books out there on doubts. I did want to address it because I felt like from, kind of a philosophical perspective, some of that could be helpful. A lot of what I was looking at could be helpful. But I really the book is as much about asking questions and how to do that than it is, as much as it is about what to do about our doubts. And so there's asking questions and there's asking questions, right? Even Jesus, like there's a lot of points in Jesus's ministry where people were asking him questions. So if you look at, like, for example, Matthew 22, where you have kind of like this string of different individuals trying to challenge Jesus, and they're asking him questions, but it like literally says their intention was to like trip him up or trap him or whatever. When I'm saying there's a huge and great value of asking questions, I don't mean that, right? I don't mean with that sort of, as I say here, posture, sort of the posture of a skeptic. Now, I've had some atheist friends of mine say, like, don't say a skeptic, like I'm a skeptic, right? What I mean by skeptic, though, is that person, and maybe the word cynic might be a better word, but this is what I mean by it. So when our kids were younger, so now our kids are teenagers and preteens, but when they were younger, they didn't want to go to bed, right? Now I love to go to bed. I can't wait to go to bed. They just, for whatever reason, kids have it like inherently in them that they don't want to go to bed. And so with our say oldest daughter, right, we would come in and say, okay, sweetie, time to go to bed. And she would say, why? That's a question. And I, as philosopher dad, like I would always try to answer her why questions, right? That was sort of my, commitment. So I'd say, well, you got to get your rest, right? So it's time to go to bed. Why? And I would say, okay, well, right, if we don't go to bed, then tomorrow's not going to be as fun because you'll be tired and grumpy and so on, so it's time to go to bed. Why? Right? Now notice, she's not looking for the truth. And this is kind of the point, is she has the posture, again, skeptic, cynic, whatever. She's just interested in not going to bed. And by the way, she's pulling it off. she's delayed going to bed. So she's doing a good job. You see what I mean? Like, I gave her knock down, drag out really good answers for her why questions, but she didn't care about that. And I do sometimes feel like people that I've talked to, like they're really not interested in the truth. They're just going to ask why no matter what answer you give. Have you been in that kind of conversation before, right? Like, now I try to hang with people like that. I try to answer every same sort of thing, but we don't ever get anywhere because I don't think they're in the posture of a truth seeker. Okay. Now, what I want to recommend, let me just say this and I'll get your question. What I want to recommend is to not be a skeptic or a cynic, but to be in the pursuit of God. As a Christian, I'm talking to Christians here. So the book is aimed at Christians. So I'm not trying to talk to I don't know where you were at, but you tell me if this would have helped at all. But what I'm trying to say is that we be in the pursuit of God. Right, and ask questions, because there's this really extraordinary passage. It comes in Matthew 22. I think this is connected, by the way, as Jesus is showing off like these logical skills and like kind of whooping up on these guys who are supposedly the religious elite scholars, and he's refuting them all over the place. But anyway, and he says, when he's asked, what's the most important thing, right, for us to do? What's the greatest commandment of all the commandments? He says to love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and notice with all of your mind. And it's so extraordinary if you think about it. And I think for a lot of us, we wonder, like, what in the world is it to love somebody with your mind? I always give this example. Probably happens on this campus too, right? But every incoming freshman class, it always happens within the first few weeks, couples form, right? And it's disgusting. No, okay. Right? Where they're like, can't be apart. Like the building could be burning to the ground and they're still just staring at each other. Right? There's this notice, I mean, there's a lot going on. But there is, right, some of what's going on is a deep curiosity in the other. And they want to know everything. They want to ask about, what do you think about this and so on, and background and everything. Like, they are, in a way, loving each other with their minds, like intellectually, like I want to know about you. Right? And I think, and they're going to notice questions. Like, that in a way is like the pinnacle. I think that's the way for Christians as we're pressing in, right? But we're struggling with some doubts. Like, ask like that. Ask in a way that you just coming out of a place of love, coming out of a place of wanting to know God better. Right now, that might not be where somebody's at if they're like about to walk away, or maybe they have walked away, or so on. But they're still out. That's going to probably look a little different, but for us as Christians, as we're leaning in and we might come across having some doubts and some questions we can't answer, it's okay. Lean into that, right? And do that, I think, out of love. That's in the posture of a lover, as I say, or a lover of God. So, yeah, that's what I'm going for there. I'm sorry, you had a question. Did you still have a question? Or did I? Sorry. I don't. Okay. No, you think of it. All right. So then, ultimately, the goal, of course, is to, believe because it's true. And that's just what I would say as a matter of testimony. This is, seminary for me was about 20 years ago as well. So it was right after I was youth pastor and so on, went back to seminary. And, I now stand in a very different place. Like I said, I don't have like the deep struggles with doubts. I still have a lot of questions. And I always do this when I get to talk, so I get to talk at like camps and things like that. And I always say like, all right, to the leaders, like, how many of you guys have everything about Christianity figured out? Raise your hand, right? And of course, none of them did. How many of you guys have just a few questions at least? And of course, all of them raised me. And I just want students to see like, that's all of us. All of us have questions. We don't have it all figured out. Look at the disciples, right? They're morons half the time. Like, they have no idea what's going on. They have questions all over the place. They're just getting it wrong. That's okay. It's about the journey. It's about, so I use this sort of metaphor of wandering. This is a quote that I love. And I love G.K. Chesterton. He just always looks like he just woke up. Right, you can kind of see where the pillow will probably look like. He says, an open mind is really a mark of foolishness, like an open mouth. Now, he means like a perpetually open mind, like always being open to everything that comes along. It's a mark of foolishness, like an open mouth, like where you're just sort of gaping open mouth. Mouths and minds were made to shut. They were made to open only in order to shut. So the point is that we're going to investigate, we're going to lean into our doubts in order to find truth, right? And when we find truth, our minds should shut on those things. Never so absolutely that we couldn't have a challenge that sort of unseats that a little bit. We need to open back up and sort of consider again, right? That's again the point about certainty, right? Yeah.
To phrase it a different way, it's that being open-minded should be a means and not an end.
Yeah, that's right. That's good. That's good. So asking our questions, being open to it. But when we find the answers, like, that's the thing, is like there is truth. And I'm just convinced that we can know truth. And I don't think there's any genuine, and I work in epistemology. I work on these things. I think there are compelling answers to these sorts of questions, philosophical questions, and we can have genuine knowledge. I'm fascinated by the concept of knowledge. And by the way, that's one of the most common concepts in the Bible is knowledge. It talks more about knowledge than it does faith. right? It's all about knowledge in a way. Jesus says this powerful passage where in John 17, his high priestly prayer, where he says, and this is eternal life, to know you, to know God, and Jesus whom you've sent. Right? It's about knowledge. And so for knowledge requires truth and having good reasons to believe truth, where your minds would shut on. Man, this is my commercial. So that's the book. Right. Anyway, and no, this is just totally, if you're interested in it or whatever, got a couple other books here too, but, right, anyway, I wrote the book in a way that's completely accessible, so it's a popular level book, and it's meant to be one that somebody who's got some struggles with doubts, I hope would be very helped by it. It's not, again, no technical language or anything like that, but hopefully robust answers to these sorts of things. Yeah.
I finally remember.
Okay, go for it. Yeah.
Okay, so I was thinking maybe your daughter would have gone to bed if you had presented it with a little more zing. Like, if you don't go to bed, your mind will rot. And you will go crazy and no longer be you.
Yeah, but when you have kids, you'll see that that's just met with another why.
Shoot.
So the whole thing is that's why parents have developed the because I said so.
Yeah.
And I always said that I would never be that parent. But after they got to about 7 of explaining and going and doing the why, and for 3 hours you finally go, because I said so. And then you learn after that, you just start with that because that's where it's going to end up. Am I right?
I tried to hang with this.
I'm
with you.
I swore I would never be the because I'm said so.
And if that would work, then kids wouldn't be on YouTube.
Yeah.
Because everybody knows that's routing our brain. Or TikTok, maybe that's the better. All right, other questions? Or is anything, any questions?
Yeah, I really liked all the principles you talked about, and I just wanted to ask specifically, when I think of doubt, like the famous passage I think of is like Doubting Thomas.
Yeah.
So I just want to know if you had any like direct commentary
Yeah.
on that passage.
I don't actually think he's doubting.
Okay.
I mean, there are doubts going on, but I actually think when you read the passage, Thomas is, I think, in a state of unbelief. Where, and this gets into just how we're going to define this, but there's what's called, in Scripture, sometimes called the sin of unbelief, where we're refusing to believe. And if you read how Thomas says it, it's not just this sort of like honest intellectual tension that he's sort of dealing with. The setting is that all the other disciples get to see Jesus risen from the dead. And Thomas is the only one that's not there. Now you have his best friends, his people he's lived with, people he trusts, come to him and say, "We've seen the risen Christ." And Thomas's response is, "I will never believe unless I not only see, not only get what you got, but also put my fingers into the wounds and have So I think there's a refusal there that I don't think is the mere struggle of doubt. Okay, so we call him the Doubting Thomas, but I think a far better example of somebody who's doubting would be John the Baptist. When he's sitting in jail, probably knowing his end is near, and he asked Jesus, "Are you the one, or should we expect someone else? Should we expect another?" Now, again, I don't want to. We don't want to like psychologize, and go beyond what the text tells us, but it would make sense if he's really kind of struggling, because you go to the beginning of the Gospels where John the Baptist baptizes Jesus, right? And he confesses him as the one. And then something's happened to force him to say, "Are you really the one?" Right? And so what's happened? Well, he's in jail. Everybody expected the Messiah. It was just the first century expectation that the Messiah would come and free them from Roman rule, basically. That there's going to be this political uprising, and that the Messiah would lead them in that. Jesus is just still out in the desert preaching. right? There's no uprising, and John's languishing in jail. I can imagine him having some deep intellectual struggles with that. And so he asks, are you the one? Now, Jesus' response is super powerful, right? If you remember what he says, he basically says, look at the evidence. He's healing people, he's raising the dead, right? He's doing miracles to give evidence for him being the Messiah, right? So I use that as a big principle to say, like, when we lean into our doubts and we begin to doubt our doubts, we need to look to the evidence in the same way Jesus points us directly out.
Wouldn't you think then that John the Baptist, this just kind of occurred to me, was really more of an emotional doubter because he certainly knew all the facts, right?
I don't know.
While
I think he
Thomas-
might have been in the grips of that sort of like first century expectation that is just not matching up with what he's seeing in the life of Jesus. He thought, along with everybody else, that Jesus would, I mean, even the other disciples, you remember in, I think it's Acts chapter 1, they say, is it now that you're going to establish your kingdom? Like, we went through all that business with the dying and rising and so on. Like, now are you going to become the political ruler that we've always expected you to be? And then he ascends and, you know. So, he will be the political ruler, but that's coming still, right? That's future. You can see that, and it's terrifying for those that aren't found in Christ, right? If you look at the book of Revelation, like, he's coming with the sword. And so there will be that political rule, but it's a future, already but not yet.
And I
I think you could also argue Thomas N was more of a volitional doubter.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
It was there were
It's a
choices to
actual choice, yeah.
refuse to believe and raising the stakes so high. But Jesus graciously conceded that. But that's what I take Jesus' sort of, commendation there of blessed are those who will believe without having to see and touch. And so on.
And I like how you talk about like the expectations things because I feel like a lot of times like we have like
Yeah,
expectations of
right.
God, and when He doesn't meet our expectations of what
Right.
He should be, that's when we start to doubt.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that having that open mind, again, like, and being a truth seeker and really seeking to know God in some ways, so.
You know, I think a good example of someone in the Bible who handled their doubt well would probably be the Bereans. Like,
Yeah.
Paul comes along and says, Jesus is the Messiah, he was crucified for your sins and then rose from the dead. Or
Yeah.
something. And then so the Bereans actually went and, they checked.
Yeah. And
Right?
it says of them that they were of noble character in that,
Yeah,
which I think is
Yeah.
really interesting.
they
That,
actually went and checked to see if this was all,
Yeah.
in accordance with the prophets.
Yeah. because they're, again, I think it's evidential. Like, they are getting, what would be for them evidence as Jews, like they held to the Old Testament as, God's inspired word. And so that was for them very compelling evidence. And I just think it's interesting that they're called of noble character in that fact, like in that they were willing, and they were the contrast with, of course, the other cities that ran them out and so on. But yeah.
I was wondering what you thought about the passage where Jesus walks on water and calls Peter out to walk with
Yeah.
him. Jesus actually calls Peter out for doubting and
Yes.
asks him, why would you doubt?
Yes.
I was wondering what you thought about
Yeah.
that.
So I think there again, like I talk about it in the book, but there is sometimes there's a reading of scripture where we think, well, doubt just seems like it's condemned wherever it sort of shows up, so doubt can't be a good thing. But I think it really, again, is more like we don't want to stay in that place of doubt. And sometimes we doubt when we know better. You know what I mean? And I think that's Peter. Like, if you think about all the things that Peter was witness to through the entire ministry of Jesus, and then he's doing this extraordinary thing, like literally walking on the water. But he sort of takes his eyes off Jesus and starts looking around and like thinking, no way this is happening right now. He starts like kind of giving into those things. And so I think Jesus is, rebuffing him or whatever, was more out of like what Peter should have known at that point in his ministry. It's not to say, but tell you what, I think that, again, like, doubt isn't an altogether good thing. Like, we don't want to stay there. But I bet you that was a really important lesson that he learned. So that when he looks back, when he would say, like, that was a fail in a way, but in the same way, he learned a huge and important lesson, and so it had that value. That's the kind of thing that I'm trying to say is like, it's not something to hold up as like, hey, all right, we're doubting, let's have a party. And it's not that kind of good. It's in philosophy we would call it an instrumental good versus a sort of good in itself. It's not the destination. It's just going to be an important stop. And I think most of our stumbles are the same way, right? You can imagine Jesus saying like, okay, that was not what you should have done, right? And so let's grow and let's get better. Let's work through those things. Let's lean into them and so on. That's kind of what I'm saying. That is helpful. Okay.
Okay. My question, it's kind of a bit related to divine hiddenness.
Oh yeah.
But it's on a macro level, like why does God put us through all this in the first place? Like
Right.
he has chosen not to give us certainty on these things. And the way Jesus talks about it and the New
Yeah.
Testament writers talk about it, faith is like a virtue and God rewards faith.
Yeah.
So what is your take on why faith matters so much to God? Like why does he set up life like this for us?
Oh, why does faith matter, or why does? Because the other almost feel like those are two different questions. So like one is like, why isn't God more obvious?
Yes,
There's that
because
kind
I
of
was
hiddenness
thinking
question.
it relates to divine hiddenness to the extent that if faith has a virtue to it, that could help explain divine hiddenness. But my root question is why does God value faith?
Oh, okay, yeah, that's a bigger, deeper question than mine. I think it's because, again, when we have a what I would call a more robust and rich notion of faith, so like, again, you guys have probably all heard this, and this is definitely preaching to the choir, but that faith is like, blind and, just belief without evidence, or as Peter Boghossian puts it, faith is pretending to know what you don't know, right? It's really just a ripoff on Mark Twain, but anyway, Twain said it better though. Twain said it's believing what you know ain't so. Right. Okay, that's not faith on my view, right? What I'm calling faith is where we trust and rely. I think that God wants faith because it puts God in his proper place in our lives, right? So if God is God, if God is, right, the greatest conceivable being, and he is the ground and source of all reality in life, then God deserves our worship and our reliance in that way. And so when we place faith in him, there's a sense in which we put him in his proper category, or put him in his proper place. Okay. Now, but I still think the first question was important too. It's like, why doesn't he become more obvious? Well, that's a big and deep question. That might be one for another day too, to go to the depths of. I'm happy to come back and talk about that at some point. But the quick answer, I think, is that when God, just even in the Bible, when God is really obvious, or take just Jesus' ministry, right? When Jesus is like doing miracles and sort of showing off a little, if we're honest, okay, he's sort of showing off a little bit, like showing who he is. What did that produce? It didn't actually produce people of faith, right? What people, it gathered crowds, no doubt. Right? A lot of people came together and it was like, okay, do it again, do another one, right? But all they really wanted was the show at that point. And then you remember that passage, I want to say it's like John 9, somewhere in there, where Jesus starts talking about discipleship and the real cost of discipleship. And he says some weird stuff, like, eating his flesh and drinking his blood. Okay. That's again, that's next time. And then people start leaving, right? And then he says to his disciples, are you going to go too? And they say, where would we go? You have the words of life. And I think, right, something happened. Something was different in the life of the disciples than the crowds. The crowds got to see all the miracles and all the crazy stuff, but they just wanted the show to continue. If they got to be at the feeding of the 5,000, they just wanted food, probably, right? Who can blame them? Okay. Right, they wanted another lunch. But the disciples found something different, and it wasn't just through the miraculous displays. The way I put it, and there is a chapter about this, but anyway, the way I put it is that miracles and the obvious stuff isn't great at producing faith. It's great at producing sort of just maybe belief, but the belief is sort of here and gone tomorrow. Right? But it doesn't cause us to put our lives and our trust. And God could be more obvious. Like, that's something that we should say, but, right, that's a terrifying prospect. Right, if Exodus is right, that if God was perfectly obvious, it would be lethal. If God really showed up in his full display of his glory, I might just wipe us all. Like, we don't want that. And if he showed up in less, sort of dialed that back some, like, we might all cower in fear and, bow down and sit, but that, again, that's not what God's after. God's after those who in love would follow him in faith. And I just think that's cultivated in different ways. In fact, where do you see the most people coming to faith rather than just mere sort of like interest or belief or something, is actually in the book of Acts. And it's at the preaching of the word and under the conviction of the Holy Spirit. That's where people come to faith. Right? There are miraculous displays in Acts too, in Acts as well, but it's really at the preaching of the word. Is that helpful? Okay.
So, yeah, this thing about divine giftedness calls to mind something I was something that I have a bit of Bible study group I went over. We went over John 16 and such, where it talks about the Holy Spirit and talking about how Jesus has to go back to his Father in order to send the Spirit down. And he says it's better for them if he leaves, than if he remains with the apostles.
Yeah.
Because and one of the things we discussed is why would it be better for them?
Right.
And it's because Jesus being there, doesn't actually require them to have as much faith. Is one thing I guess we're touching here.
Mm. Yeah, I don't.
Or like they're like when Jesus is not there, they now are doing the work of Jesus.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it is sort of like crazy, isn't it, a little bit, that like when Jesus was on earth, he didn't really have, like, he had followers for sure, but it didn't explode until he left. And then it's in the book of Acts that it's preaching of the word that you have people coming to this place of repentance and coming in faith. And so there's something about that. Again, I don't know that I've got it all figured out, but
The Spirit indwells Christians.
Yeah.
In that new era, which is pretty significant.
yeah, absolutely.
I have a question. When it comes to like doubts generated, there's obviously a limited time in one person's life, so we can't always dig deeply into every single question.
Right.
So how do we know which ones to dig into?
That's a really good question. I think you can follow your interests. I had somebody tell me that early on in my journey, and it was invaluable advice. Because it's kind of interesting how some people might be just absolutely fascinated and taken by the problem of divine hiddenness. And other people are like, yeah, it's not my thing. And that's okay. Like, in a way, that's okay. Some people are more given to like science and, problems and questions and reasons and so on. And some people are like, please don't bring that attention. Right? Some people like philosophy, some people like history, and I think it's all okay. Now, I don't think we should just turn a blind eye to something like that. It's kind of in our face that way. But I think you can follow your interests. And again, with the whole bit about the posture that we should take, and where I said I'm assuming I'm talking to Christians in this mostly, because if you don't even believe God exists, obviously you're not going to take the posture of a lover of God. So if we've got good reasons to believe that God exists, and we want to get on this journey where we're really pursuing Him and loving Him with our mind and asking these deep and difficult questions and knowing Him in this bigger and better way, and deeper way, I think we can follow our interests. And that's okay. It's okay to do. And I always say this too, like, some practical tips that I always give for people who are struggling with doubts in some ways is like, just take it one step at a time. Don't try to get it all figured out and all solved all in one shot, because you'll never do it and you'll just get overwhelmed. And then also do it in community, which is exactly what you guys have here. Right? A lot of people don't have this. They're the only one in their church that seems to care at all about, these deep and difficult questions and the issues of apologetics and things like that. So value the community that you have and walk with people. I think, you as a group, you guys might have certain interests that you should pursue and that you should sort of trace out as you go.
And by interest, you mean possibly like whatever's bothering you, don't just suppress it.
Yeah.
But,
I was gonna say, just from a personal perspective, that, because I went through a lot of this stuff, I would recommend, if there's something that you feel like getting in the way of your relationship with God, like you're gonna have tons of questions on, whatever it is, like maybe like infallibility of the Bible or something like that, right? Like, for me, that's not a big deal. Like, if we found out that, there were a couple things that weren't, that wouldn't bother me, that wouldn't shake my faith. But, let's take an easy one. If something was wrong with the resurrection, I had a doubt about the resurrection, that would obviously be a big deal, right? So if you find something getting in your way of that relationship, I would say, like, jump on those, and the other ones, get to them, But his points about not trying to solve it all at once, because that's what I tried to do, and I got into these spin sessions. Where I'd be 4 a.m. jumping from topic to topic and just like trying to just focus down on one thing and doing a community, because you feel like you're all alone most of the time. I mean, those are really good points.
One other thing, you said something about like remove yourself emotionally and like seek truth or whatever, but like.
Yeah, get a little distance.
Easier said than like,
Yes.
what is your advice for, because I feel like a lot of the, we're talking about like your students who's like watching children stuff, like that's kind of emotional, like how do you just remove yourself from that?
Yeah. So what I had said was get some emotional distance, because I think when it's kind of too up in our face, it's just hard to think of it and sort of size it up for what it is. It can feel like this really big problem, right? But we just need a little distance to be able to think carefully about it and know what sort of problem it is, because I think that's sometimes half the battle, is just to say, if this is true, so what? Like, what does it mean for my faith? And so, like, some people, I was actually I spoke at my church last night on science, actually, and so we were talking about the age of the universe, for example. And some people, like, find that there's evidence for an old universe, and they're freaking out, right? And they're thinking, it's all false. And I want to say, like, no, that could, that's a view, that's a respectable view. Even if the universe turns out to be very, very old, I don't think that's, right, hopefully I'm not losing anybody here, but anyway, like, I don't think that's a devastating problem for Scripture, because I don't think Scripture really weighs in on the age of or age of the universe. So I don't think, though, we can completely remove ourselves from most of these things. I think that, again, typically, like, when we're struggling with it, it's because it's hitting something, probably emotionally in some way or another. But as much sort of kind of taking some of that pressure off, I guess that's what I'm aiming to do there, is just to say, look, first of all, you can have some doubts and have faith. You're not sinning, you're not abnormal, and in fact, you're probably more courageous. And hopefully that allows there to be a little distance so that they can then think through those things and sort of come up with some answers. Because I do think it's hard to look at poverty, suffering, and so on. But if we can kind of take a step back and get a little distance from it, it's terrible. It's awful. It's horrific. It doesn't mean that God doesn't exist. No. There's no good reason to think that an all-good and all-powerful God doesn't exist. It doesn't also care for that person and so on. You see what I mean? So like when we can start to think of it carefully, the hope would be at least that we can come to some answers. But when we're right there with it, it's hard to just think carefully about it and come to those intellectual answers.
How would you describe following through with a love for God when you get to those topics that, like the problems of evil and suffering, that can be really angry when you think about them?
Yeah, but I guess, or maybe I don't fully understand the question, so please, if I'm not answering it, then say it again. But I guess my view would be to say, because I think that's what I have found with those really hard ones, like the problem of evil, and even the way we're talking about that. They're some of the most pastoral ones too. Like I think we learn about the bigness of God and even the love of God in those, in ways that I don't think we would kind of get there otherwise. And I know I just probably won't have the time to like unpack all that. But in other words, for me, when we find here's what I'm trying to say. When we find an answer to say the problem of evil and the problem of pain and suffering, the answer is that, for the Christian answer, is going to be that God is there and that God does love us, and that just because there's evil in the world and pain and suffering, there are good answers to those questions to show that God is loving and good and there for us, right? But we can definitely be in the thick of it and experiencing the emotions of anger and so on. But, and again, maybe I'm not understanding the question, but getting a little emotional distance, coming to that place of finding some answers. It may not solve all things. It may not make all those emotions go away. And again, like when I see children suffering, it's like, obviously I feel, sympathy and for them and want to do something and so on, just like everybody else. But that doesn't, at the end of the day, disprove a loving, good God that's all powerful, that's there, and so on, and will set all things new, and will set things right one day. Does this answer your question?
Halfway.
Okay.
The other half is just like how do we approach it without losing that love for God ourselves?
Oh.
In the thick of like that anger when we see such things.
What was the question?
So, let me take a stab at what I think you're asking. How do we, and you tell me if I'm right, how do we approach our doubts and our questions in a way that we don't kind of lose our faith in a way? And that's why I say, like, I wish I could say that will never happen. I wish I can say that when you look at the compelling answers to the problem of pain and suffering and the problem of evil and so on, that like it'll just solve all issues. It's just that good. I think those answers are there, right? I'm convinced that we've got extremely compelling answers to the problem of evil and everything that we've talked about. But I can't guarantee somebody doesn't come into it and sort of, can't get rid of the anger, can't get rid of the emotional struggle, can't get rid of the worry that God just isn't there, that he's not good or something. Right? All I can do is report my own experience, and that is struggling through these things and doing it, committing my life to it in a way. Like I literally get paid to do this, to ask these questions, right? Best job ever. I find the answers compelling where, again, does it solve all issues? No, I still have questions, but they're so compelling that I'm moved to worship. I'm moved to worship God for being there, for being good. And again, that's sort of, again, coming back to the book of Job, doesn't actually get his questions answered. why did he have to go in fact, we know more about Job's situation than he does. Because we can read Job chapter 1 and 2, where we get this sort of like behind the curtain kind of thing. Right, but he gets God at the end. And that's why I say that's that pastoral point, is that I think with the problem of evil, the answer is that God is there, and we won't necessarily get all of our questions about, like, why did this little, child have to suffer like he or she did. We don't get that answer just the same way Job doesn't, but we get God, and God is there, and we have to trust. So we talked about faith. We at the end of the day have to have trust in Him, even in that.
I think we are out of time, so thank you so much for coming. That was great.
I'll put a few books out if anybody's interested. There's a apologetics sort of textbooky book. This is called Logic in the Way of Jesus. So it's relating logic to the life of Jesus. So it's sort of a logic book. And then I've got the Wandering book. 15, 20, and 15, and I'll give you a deal if you want all three. How's that?
Awesome.
Cool. Thanks so much.
All right, of course. Yeah.